Basically, this is being brought to you by me on behalf of the RAF Burtonwood Association. We set this up in 1988, really to perpetuate the memory of the men and women who served at Burtonwood, both military and civilian, British, American, and any other nationality who served there, but predominantly British and American. Sadly, many of our members passed away. Especially the wartime ones. We have virtually none left from World War II, having had many hundreds of them in the past. We have a heritage centre at Gulliver's World at Warrington. It is free entry. It's not open every day. You need to go onto the website for the Burtonwood Heritage Centre, and it is absolutely jam-packed full of material relating to the story of Burtonwood, and behind it is a village of small buildings covering different aspects. Then, back in 2016, we received the nose of a C-54 commemorating the Berlin airlift, where all the Berlin airlift aircraft were serviced at Burtonwood for their 200-hour check, and over 1,500 checks were done, many aircraft coming backwards and forwards several times. This is now a major exhibit in our Heritage Centre. This is the cockpit, and we can't afford a lift to it, but there is a pretty easy-going staircase with a landing halfway, so you can get halfway, have a rest, and then get up to the top of it. So that's proving to be always a very popular attraction. There's an air police squadron there from the 50s, is reflected in that building on the right. We have had reunions in the States since 1988. Had over 40 of them. This is quite a big one in Las Vegas back in 2000. You can see the sort of numbers we were getting. We've done our best to commemorate and keep the memory of Burtonwood. And in St. Michael's Church, Burtonwood is this village, this window in the village church, which has many items on it. There's a P-47 Thunderbolt head on there. There's a Spitfire actually across the window. There's a B-17 down in the bottom, and a lot in that window, and an explanation board on the left-hand side. That's a permanent record. We have a lot of places where we have remembered Burtonwood. In the States, we had sorry, I'm getting people's voices. Can you make sure, please, you're all muted so we're not picking up voices? Nearly finished the introduction, but the Barksdale Air Force Base, which is a B-52 base, has this in its museum. We also have reunions in the UK, and here we are at the Fiddle just outside Burtonwood Village, which very, very sadly was demolished last week. It's been empty for some time. It had been burnt out by a fire. But this was the group we had there in 2014. Also, I produce a magazine 4 times a year. Members of the association get the magazine, and that comes out, as I say, every quarter. I've also I've done 2 books on Burtonwood. The first one sold out a long time ago, are still available, and you can actually get these directly from me or from the Heritage Centre. They are available. So that's the end of the trailer, and we go back to RAF Burtonwood. So why was Burtonwood built? Well, it's all this guy's fault. He created, obviously, the Nazi Party and took control of Germany and started building up his forces, and it was obvious there was going to be war, and we had to prepare for it. The Nazi Party created a lot of problems. So the RAF expanded on a series of expansion programs, part of which was forming the various commands, and Maintenance Command was obviously a very important one, always held in the back, rarely getting publicity, because obviously the fighter, bomber and coastal commands got all the publicity because they were on the front line. But all the aircraft for the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Force needed to be supported, supplied, modified, repaired, etc. So Burtonwood opened as part of maintenance unit.
Sorry to interrupt you, but your slide was stuck, but it's moved now, so that's great.
Sorry, who was that?
It was Charles, but I was just to say your slides were stuck, but they're now moving again, so thank you.
The slide's stuck.
They were, but they're not. They're now moving.
Okay, that should be a picture of a station headquarters, which is actually at Coltishall. What I'm doing is illustrating the type of architecture. It would have had nicer Georgian-style windows. Well, this is one of the earlier expansion program developments. Burtonwood was a later one, and the buildings became more utility. This is Mary Ann's site. I'll talk about the site in more detail, but the early versions of these type of hangars were steel framed and lined with brick, but by the time we get to Burtonwood, they're made of concrete, and they were having to throw them up very, very fast because they needed so many of these places. So they started building Burtonwood in 1939, and it was one of many maintenance units which were being constructed around the country. And it opened on the 1st of April 1940 as number 37 maintenance unit. There were many other maintenance units, and the blue dots show some of the others, not all of them, but the major ones, which were scattered around the country, mainly on the west side of the country where possible, and obviously as remotely as possible from occupied Europe, because there were going to be large numbers of aircraft on these sites, and they didn't want them to be attacked by the Luftwaffe. The idea was that the aircraft would be supplied from the manufacturers to the RAF at the maintenance units, where they would be checked, prepared for service. A lot of aircraft were delivered, for instance, without radios, and they were fitted at the maintenance units. So Burtonwood was one of many, nothing particularly special about it from the beginning. That changed. Many of them became joint users in that they had another use besides the maintenance unit. And the local ones to us in the northwest of the country were Sealand, and that included a maintenance unit and a flying training school, as did Shawbury, Shropshire, Turnhill in Shropshire as well. Harden, which is now Chester, the British, the Airbus factory where they make Airbus wings, that was also a major maintenance unit, as you will see. At Burtonwood, we had the RAF Maintenance Unit, and we also had a major civilian repair depot called BRD, and it's always been referred to as BRD site, Burtonwood Repair Depot. It was going to open as 47 MU, but it didn't. It opened up as BRD, or Burtonwood Repair Depot, and initially it was managed by Fairey Aviation, who built aircraft like the Albacore and different Fairey aircraft, and Bristol Engines, who of course made many of the engines for RAF aircraft. So it opened in April 1940, number 47 MU. The name went across to Harden, and that became 47 MU. Now, it was built, as all these places were, in the middle of the countryside. This is an old map, but Warrington here is very small, and it is located in the middle of the fields here. It had two small runways. I've put on the railway, Liverpool, Manchester, via Warrington Railway, which is this one here. And the main site, the tech site, is the red dot. Literally in the middle of fields, very, very different to what you'd see today. Then they built the other sites spread around the runways to spread the airfield out as wide as possible in case of enemy air attack. It was also hemmed in somewhat by the industrial areas of Liverpool and Manchester, where there were balloons. So it made flying in and out of Burtonwood a little bit risky. And here you had a balloon area on the left from Liverpool, the Manchester one up in the top here. And this says it's a balloon area here at Tatton Park. In fact, it's where they the parachuting school, which was based here at Ringway, and now Manchester Airport, they would take all their trainee parachuters and drop them onto the park area at Tutton Park. So it was dangerous dropping paratroopers. So anybody coming in and out of Burtonwood, had to be very cautious that they could be a problem with barrage balloons, which were designed to stop low-flying German aircraft. So the airfield opened looking like this. It had two small runways. They were very short, just over 3,000 feet long. The main site was is this site here, and it had a name. It was Tech Site. Often it's just called Headquarters Site. The repair depot is down here, tucked one away from the airfield, but linked to it. And there were various other sites, which I'll talk about around the airfield, and some dispersals out here. The runways were short because the aircraft which we were flying at the beginning of the war, or certainly in 1939 when building started, were very light types. We had no four-engined aircraft. They were all single or twin-engined, and they could easily land on these two short runways. Times were to change. They had a very simple control tower. This is a standard RAF type. It's colloquially known as a fort type control tower. And the controller would sit at the top up here, two or three of them. Many of the aircraft would be flying without radios, and they would use lamps from up here to keep a red or a green light, safe to land or not. And here's a hangar on Mary Ann site. So that's how it all started off. This photograph is a Luftwaffe total reconnaissance aircraft. They photographed the majority of the UK before the war, and obviously continued during the war when they could. This is dated about 1940, when the runways were built, but the earth is still all disturbed for the new building for the different sites. So you can clearly see the two runways, and they had annotated it for these two red circles, saying there was flak anti-aircraft guns in those locations. And the track linking the repair depot to the airfield is this red dotted line. So the repair depot was receiving aircraft and issuing aircraft using the airfield, and the maintenance unit was doing the same, using all the different hangars. For a short while, the repair depot was also using Mary Ann site here, and for a while also they called it Mary Ann Airport, but not for long. So that's how it looked, and that's a track leading from BRD site through to Mary Ann site and the airfield. The dispersals were located here, and the whole purpose of those were that aircraft were parked out there, and if there was an attack, it was going to be very difficult to bomb and damage all the airfield. It would take a lot of bombers with the sort of bombs they were using in the early part of the war. They could probably damage this area more than anywhere else. So also spread around in the dispersal areas and in the fields all over the area around were what we call robin hangars. And these were little standard type of hangar, not very big. It could accommodate approximately 2 Spitfires. And that was to provide covered space where aircraft could be worked on. But there were so many aircraft, it was impossible to put them all under cover. Most of them were just parked out in the wide open fields. So the airfield soon proved to be too small. Before Pearl Harbor, before the Americans came. So they built a third runway. And this was they started in March 1942. And this is the runway which became even longer after the war. And this is where the M62 runs now. And the other two runways are here. This one was realigned. You can actually see the color is the same as the new runway. And the third runway was running across here. It was extended. It stopped at this perimeter track here. It extended out to this further point here. And at the other end, it was extended from there to there as well. So now we had 3 runways. This one was running east-west, going in to the north there, it's going due west. This is more into the prevailing wind coming from the southwest, but this one tended to be used more than ever. They were all connected by a 50 feet wide perimeter track all the way around, so aircraft could taxi on the hard surface rather than on the grass. where they were liable to sink in wet weather. So here's another view from a different direction. This is the new runway. To the right, it goes to Liverpool. To the left, it goes to Warrington. Here's BRD site in the background, and the track can be seen leading across here to Marianne site, which is there, and then they could come onto the airfield. The control tower, the original control tower, was over here. So now that they've built a runway with aircraft taking off and landing here, they had to relocate the control tower. So that one was made derelict. They built a new one in this point here. It also caused a problem locally in that there was a pub here called the Limerick. And that was so close to the end of the runway, it was considered to be a hazard. So they demolished the Limerick pub, much to the consternation of the workmen. So this is the second tower, which was a standard RAF type of tower. It was built on many different stations around the country. Locally, RAF Wood Vale has a tower exactly the same. The local control on the top is different, but the main building is the same layout. And here's a view of it in the snow, taken much later. Quite a nice view across the airfield. The Limerick pub is this one here. Ian Murphy, one of our very earliest members, he provided this photograph for me. It was Burtonwood Breweries who actually owned it, and it's gone, I'm afraid, and there's no trace of it anymore. So after the extension of the base, this is how it looked. The runway they had realigned was left as a parking area, and this is the one here which they realigned for it. There were parking areas all the way around so they could disperse the aircraft off the perimeter track. And the ones I pointed out earlier were up to the top here and off to the right here. So it was getting bigger and bigger, still a long time before there was any evidence of American involvement. This is part of BRD site. It's a still of a film which was produced by the Imperial War Museum, and it actually shows parts of Burtonwood under construction. I haven't got time to show the video, but this is literally part of BRD site under construction. So around the sites, very briefly to tell you about those before we move on. You know the picture here, tech site, the main site here, the technical site, which is where all the workshops were, and the living accommodation had two hangars, two J-type hangars here. The headquarters building was here, which is a standard maintenance command, single-story maintenance building. They had stores here, workshop here, and other ancillary buildings. The guardroom was here. This is Barrow Hall Lane, which still exists in Warrington, and Barrow Hall School is on it now. And it was a country lane which was cut off just off the photograph here, but it kept open from the railway station and the Liverpool Warrington Road. And the main way into the site was up this road, past the guardroom, where you stopped to be checked, and then into whatever the base was. You were going on the base, and hundreds of people came onto this base. That is the headquarter building, which was used for the headquarters for both the maintenance unit, and the sign on there is an American sign. There's pictures taken much later. Now also note the RAF flag up here, and you'll hear me referring to it as RAF Burtonwood. And all American bases in the UK, not just the airfields, but all the ones occupied by the American Air Force. And that included, in fact, a Marine base in the Cold War down in Southampton. They were called RAF stations because they were loaned to the Americans by the RAF, and they had an RAF commander and an American commander. A lot of people ask the question, why is it RAF? So here we have Marianne site. Now, Marianne site often would be just given a number, A site or B site. It has a name after a thicket of woods up at this little lane here, which was called Marianne Lane. And these woods were there until comparatively recently, so they decided they call this site Marianne site. These buildings came later in the war, but it was a second major site where they could do modifications, maintenance, repair, and upgrade any type of aircraft in these hangars. The doors were 150 feet wide. They could take any aircraft, including the later the B-17s, or the RAF Lancaster. Photograph taken in 1973 shows the hangars as they were. A lot of the buildings had been demolished, and a lot of the hard standing had been built by the Americans. The original control tower was about here, but this is Mary Ann site. Moving on, BRD site, as I mentioned, is the big site down here. A close-up of that details that it's just off the railway line, going to the top right off to Warrington, to the bottom left, it goes down to Liverpool. It had a big railway network. At its height, there were over 4.5 miles of railway on Burtonwood. And there were two major buildings, one of which was used for engine overhaul, and that was ripping down an engine totally to its smallest component, checking every single item, reassembling it, and then test running it. And across the back here were test beds. So as soon as an engine had been passed as being overhauled, they would put it into the test bed area. Initially, they had hush houses so they could reduce the noise, but as the numbers grew, it was impossible, so they were out in the open air. They would put a propeller on them, they would run them and check things like the oil pressure and the compression and make sure that they were working properly before they were packaged up and sent off anywhere in the UK or to any of the aircraft on the base. The railway lines were feeding materials in and out. There was a major heating station here. The whole area was heated by coal-powered fire station, and there were sidings where the coal wagons would come and it would heat the water which was pumped around the buildings. This was a hangar here, and they were so short of accommodation when the Americans came, they called that hangar Site 10, and 1,000 of them lived in that in triple bunk beds for a few months while the accommodation was being built. The NCO club was here for the whole site, and the main entrance was here with the main building being there. I'm going to have to keep moving here. This is a view from the air. This is the NCO's mess here. The main entrance is down in this direction, and the airfield is off to the right. Once the Americans came, it was nicknamed Lancashire's Detroit. Burtonwood was in Lancashire during World War II before we had the boundary revision. It's now in Cheshire. Well, it's now in Merseyside, but it did move into Cheshire with the boundary revision. But during the majority of its life, it was actually in Lancashire. Here's another view from the ground, looking down. Standard type sheds. These were built in many locations in the UK. Factory type buildings. And during the American occupation, 10,000 men were allocated to work in these buildings. During the British occupation, the RAF occupation, up to 1942, 4,000 civilian British guys and women and boys as well. In fact, quite young boys worked in there. They were working, doing many different jobs, building different types of parts for aircraft, things like wiring looms, as well as assembling some aircraft and doing this major job of engine overhauling. The main entrance onto BRD site with the headquarter building in the background. The sign there sadly disappeared. I would love to have been able to save it, but disappeared many years ago. Then around the periphery of the airfield, spread out as wide as possible to avoid enemy air attack, we have a site. And to orientate you here, this is the main runway. This is now the M62. Junction 8, which is the junction for Burtonwood, is here. Burtonwood services are here. And the bolt of lightning is approximately here. On the north side, we have Lockheed Drive, running parallel to the runway. And on the south side, we have, I've forgotten the name. It's the Airmen's Club. Sorry, the name escapes me for a second. It'll come back. But the two roads run parallel to it, and the motorway is actually on that runway. The site had two hangars. Again, they were used not just for storage, but for maintenance of aircraft, modification, etc. Here they are in use with aircraft parked outside, and the airfield with the taxiway there and runways in the background there. There were other similar sites. There was E site, And these hangars were built for storage, but in fact, once the war got going, there was very little opportunity of storing aircraft because they were needed. And the type of hangar on this site was this, an L-type hangar, which had no windows and the smaller doors and a simple concrete hangar with a steel roof. Some of them were covered in grass, and they were used for storage of parts. And after the war, they were certainly used for storage, but during World War II, there wasn't time to store aircraft. There was another similar site called G site, located down here, which is tech site is just off the picture to the top there. And this is a huge living site, which was all around the major part of tech site. And here again, these hangars were the same L-type hangars and as on E site. And we only had E and G. They would have originally called the other sites A, B, C, etc. But those names were lost except for A, E, and G. So they've all gone, of course, there's nothing left. But this is G site, which I've just been showing you. These are the two hangars here on tech site. The control tower is out here, the second control tower. Barrow Hall Lane comes up this way. The way in is here to the guard room. And on the other side of the road was all this living accommodation. And that grew and grew and grew. Initially, the airmen were living in tents because it wasn't finished. And then the buildings were slowly built up until there wasn't enough space and they had to build other sites, as I will explain. And one of the other sites was Site 1. This site here was built in approximately 1943 to house the Americans who were coming into the base at an incredible rate. This is Burtonwood Road here, going left up to junction 8 of the M62. It's now a much wider road, and there's a junction around here to Borsodi Boulevard, named after the test pilot who was killed. And the traffic lights are around this point at the moment. So you go off to the left here and you're onto the roundabout over the motorway. The site included a mess hall and recreation facilities, a chapel, so they could go to church, multinational, denomination. Main entrance here with the guard room. Probably didn't even have a fence around it because the worry of security in those days was so slight. So that's number one site. Number two site was behind Mary Ann site, which is off to the top there. It became a massive, great living site. It had a hospital in it, 200-bed hospital, had the officers' mess, and it had recreation halls here and here where everybody was fed. You needed big areas to feed all these people. The buildings were Nissen-type huts to be thrown up very quickly, temporary buildings designed for the duration of the war. Site 3 was on the other side of the railway. This is the line from going off to the top left there is to Warrington, bottom left is to go to Liverpool, and this is Sycamore Lane down here, and that's the only road which is left. Everything else is gone, it's all been redeveloped. And this little area down here, there were Ministry of Defence police houses, and they are the only remaining buildings on the site which hark back to just after World War II. This site, I hope you've got the screens detailed enough to see it. This is Sycamore Lane. These are the police houses. That's BRD site. The railway runs across here. Warrington West Railway Station is here. And they sold off half of this site after the war and built the tobacco houses here, which were occupied first of all by the Americans and then later by the British. Lots and lots of sites spread all over the place. Two more living sites, on the left side 4, on the right side 5. So, and in the middle, there was mess accommodation and shops. It became a major PX, the Post Exchange, with lots and lots of shops, post office, barbers, clothes shops, furniture shops, car shop, etc. These were mostly Nissen huts, and they weren't linked to the ablutions, the toilets, the showers, and everything. The poor guys had to go out in whatever weather to go into the communal blocks if they wanted a shower or to use the bathroom. So these sites were designed and built to accommodate hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Americans. And in later lectures, I'll talk about further use after World War II. They were great when the weather was okay, but during the war and post-war, Warrington had, like Manchester, terrible reputation for rain, fog, sleet, snow, etc. So it looked like this, and it wasn't very cozy. The huts were heated with coke stoves. Coke stove there, and the flue going right up. Mostly of it would have two. Very difficult to light. Once they were lit, if you could get the coke, the whole thing would glow red and it'd be very, very hot. And then by the morning it had gone out and you were freezing. They had to have bunks because there were so many men that they needed to double up on the accommodation as much as they could. They had some cupboards and wardrobes, but very, very few. Most of their belongings were in their own personal trunks in front of each of the beds. And so that is all the different sites around the airfield. And we come into the aircraft now, which actually landed there. And the base opened on the 1st of April 1940. The very first aircraft to come in was on the 19th of April. And the base wasn't finished. The runways weren't finished. The living accommodation wasn't finished. But this Oxford, Airspeed Oxford, was flying along. It had an engine problem. One engine had failed. He looked down. He saw two runways. He assumed it was an airfield he could use, so he just landed. He had to avoid some contractors' equipment on the runway, and he got rather a shock when he realized it was still being built. They repaired the aircraft and he took off, and that was the very first one that landed on Burtonwood in history. It was followed a few days later by four, not three, but four of these weird, very simple light bombers called the Handley Page Hampden. The nickname was the Flying Suitcase because it looked like it was a suitcase with a tail on the back. And these particular ones that came into Burtonwood had been built by English Electric at Samlesbury, at Preston. And they were brand new, and they were flown in on the 26th of May, 1940. And there were enough RAF personnel there to start looking at them, servicing them, making sure they were all fit for service, and then issuing them out to the squadrons. 3 days later, three more came in, and the build-up started. Different types of aircraft. One of the next ones to come in was a Bristol Beaufort. 7 of those came in June 1940, and they were followed by another 13 Hampdens, another 9 Magister trainers, a very basic trainer, but one up from the Tiger Moth, the biplane trainer, more powerful and faster, still had a fixed undercarriage, a little bit like a very simple Chipmunk, but an open cockpit. He uses a basic trainer. They were coming in from Miles, which had a factory at Reading near where I live. 9 of those came in June 1940, and 17 Oxfords, like the one which came in first, came in June. The next month, the numbers had grown, and they had all sorts of different types. The Bristol Beaufort, the Buffalo, was an American aircraft, which was coming in under Lend-Lease, which I'll talk about. Some more Hampdens, some Lysanders, very high wing communication and aircraft. 10 more Magisters came in, 20 more Ansons came in, but more importantly, 21 Spitfires. They were delivered in from, these are receipts, into the maintenance unit from the factories, and 3 Whitleys, which are twin-engined bombers. So they came in, and now the Spitfires were important. July 1940, the Battle of Britain was just starting, and the RAF needed Spitfires desperately. So the onus was on getting these Spitfires out and getting them issued to the squadrons as fast as they possibly could. In August, this is the number of aircraft which were issued by Burtonwood. They had already come in, they'd been worked on, and it included 16 Spitfires here, a huge number of Ansons. I'll talk about those in a second. Oxford's twin-engine training aircraft like the Ansons, and just 1 solitary Whitley. But the numbers were building up and up and up, to a point that on one day, on the 22nd of August, 32 Ansons like this arrived in the same day. They were flown up from St Athan in South Wales. The air traffic control knew they were coming. They didn't come together in one formation, but they came pretty close together, and they had to be ready to receive them, to be able to park them somewhere and to work on them. And all the crews, of course, there were 22 crews, a crew of 2 in these aircraft. They were ferried back to Crewe, oddly enough, railway station, where they got the train back down to South Wales. But the Spitfires, in August, 16 more were delivered into the maintenance unit, and 19 were issued out to the Royal Air Force. And this is one of them. And one which is an interesting one is this specific one, which is a Mark 5B, and its serial number is BM598. This aircraft was delivered in 1941 from Burtonwood, and it is still flying today. It was delivered from Burtonwood to Wood Vale, where there were some Polish squadrons who were resting from the action down in 11 Group, where they were protecting London. And they came up to Wood Vale and they re-equipped. So they re-equipped with these new aircraft, and they passed them, in fact, from one squadron to another, 315 and 317. Well, this aircraft then went on to be a trainer with a maintenance unit and survived the war, has been really rebuilt a few times, but it is still flying today, based at Duxford. Absolutely amazing. What about the Luftwaffe? Well, amazingly, Burtonwood was only bombed twice, and it wasn't serious bombing at all. They had 2 false alarms very, very early on, but on the 6th of September, getting towards the end of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe dispatched aircraft across, and the first bombing attack was on the 6th of September. On the 27th of September, 2 enemy aircraft flew over very low, and they dropped incendiary bombs, but they did virtually no damage. You can imagine an incendiary bomb is a very small bomb, but it bursts into flames when it lands. To try and make any impact on a place the size of Burtonwood was going to be very, very difficult. I think one aircraft was possibly slightly damaged, and a cow was also injured in one of the fields, but that was it. And it was never, ever raided again. They had lots of false alarms. Why? I do not know. The Germans were out of their mind not attacking it, but they didn't. They did, however, drop bombs on Warrington. And on the 14th of September 1940, there was an attack on a property in Church Street, which is now where Sainsbury's supermarket is, and also Thames Board Mills, which is alongside the River Mersey and where the village hotel is today. And this is a memorial. There was a sports festival going on, and the German aircraft must have looked down and seen all these people, brightly coloured tents, and it dropped bombs on it, and they killed. There was a memorial there today. There were 2,500 people attending this event, and at 5:05 in the evening, the one lone bomber dropped 2 bombs, and he killed 16 men, women, and children, and many, many more were seriously injured. And this plaque, which is this one here on the wall, still there now, commemorates that sad event. But Burtonwood was getting bigger and bigger, to the extent that they were still seriously worried. The Blitz had blitzed during 1940, the end of 1940, early 41. Liverpool and Manchester had been seriously hit. So they wanted to disperse their aircraft as far as they could. So they looked at stately homes. Tatton Park, I mentioned, where they dropped the parachutists. So they looked at Knowsley Hall, Knowsley Park, and Lord Derby's estate. Knowsley Hall is here. They built a runway, a grass runway here, and they ferried aircraft, particularly Wellington bombers, out to Knowsley Park and took them under the trees, natural camouflage, or put nets over them and parked them there until they could work on them and fly them back to Burtonwood for work. That's Burtonwood, and Knowsley Park was located very, very close by between Burtonwood and Liverpool. Then another major event which started to impact on the story of Burtonwood was Lend-Lease. And here we have President Roosevelt in March 1941. Pearl Harbor was December 41. But in March 41, under a huge amount of pressure from Churchill and the Allies, he signed the bill for Lend-Lease. Basically, the idea was that America would lend the Allies aircraft in which to partake the war on the basis that they gave them back at the end of the war. Clearly, that wasn't an option, but no one was going to worry about that with the war going on as it was. A huge amount of money involved, and in many cases, they were not delivered direct. They were taken to Canada, sometimes literally towed across the border, and then delivered across the Atlantic from Canada. But as times changed and as America got nearer to the war, they came direct. So we were now suddenly getting American-built aircraft into the RAF. And I mentioned the Brewster Buffalo before, and this was one of the very early types of fighter we got. It wasn't very successful. Most of them were sent out to the Far East. Sorry, moved on too quickly. But the Brewster Buffaloes came in and were marked up with RAF insignia on them and distributed out to the squadrons. Also a light bomber, the Martin Maryland. 75 of these had been ordered by France before France fell to the Nazis. So they were diverted to Britain. All the instrumentation was metric, so I had to change the instruments so it was in feet and knots, etc. They were painted up and they were issued out. 75 of those passed through BRD site and the maintenance unit to be delivered to the RAF. And the very first B-17s to arrive in the country were sent over for the RAF under Lend-Lease. Here it's in Coastal Command markings. You see the RAF roundel, and 20 of these were delivered in, prepared for service. They were not terribly successful. They were the early mark, but they passed through Burtonwood. Most of this work was undertaken on BRD site. And the reason why they came into Burtonwood was because of its location near to the docks at Liverpool, because most of these aircraft could not fly across the Atlantic. Certainly the single engine ones couldn't. So they came by sea, and they needed somewhere close to those docks where they could work on them. A bit more about that later. Another type was the Boston. Spelt wrong, sorry, excuse my English. But Boston, it's a Boston with a B. The A-20. This is in American markings, but the RAF flew them mostly in the Mediterranean and Middle East area. But 140 Bostons passed through Burtonwood, and many of them were converted. Well, they changed the name. In fact, the RAF called them Havocs. And also they converted some of them into turbine lights, which was a very strange modification with a huge searchlight put in the nose, not like this nose, but a different one. And that conversion was done at Burtonwood and at Sealand. And the very first station magazine was produced, and it was called Havoc after the RAF Roundel Havoc aircraft here, which was really an A-20 Boston. So now the RAF were receiving American aircraft. They had to know how to maintain them and modify them and repair them. So because they were coming into Burtonwood, the RAF formed a school of technical training, and it just so happened it was number 21 in its formation. And they were formed in July 1941 with the sole purpose of teaching RAF mechanics how to operate American aircraft, how to work on their airframes, their engines, their guns, their undercarriages, and all the equipment they carried. And because lots of the aircraft were coming into Burtonwood, they could actually train on the real thing. So we had a mixture of RAF and one or two American instructors and one or two American civilians from the manufacturers. And they came and formed this unit. There's an American on the left there, as you can see. And they worked on BRD site, and they would run courses specifically on a type of engine. It might be on a Wright Cyclone radial engine. It might be on Pratt & Whitney engine, etc., specifically to train the RAF. So a load of RAF people were coming backwards and forwards doing these courses, which ranged from anything from a week to 2 weeks. The first marriages started. Here's one of the members of the School of Technical Training at a marriage, and there's a mixture of American and RAF uniforms at the wedding here. They also, well, they worked on P-51 Mustangs, and here's one in one of the hangars where they're working on it. So they, Corporal Stevenson is this guy here, and he was the guy who was married, in fact. So Marianne site is where they operated from down here, down there. As I said, initially the civilians at BRD site were using Marianne site as well, but that was taken back very quickly, as was A site. Bristol Bisley was the only British type of aircraft which was actually assembled at Burtonwood. They were made in different factories, some at Speke and some at Mere down in Staffordshire. I don't know why they were not assembled there, but they were brought to Burtonwood to be assembled. And this was on BRD site. And there were other organisations there, like Bristol Engines, who were organising the maintenance of the engines, and Fairey Aviation, who were having parts of aircraft being built in the facility which was there. All sorts of different companies had names there, far too long to talk about here. The biggest problem with the aircraft, with the maintenance unit, with the RAF, was they were putting them out into the dispersal areas. For instance, a lot of Spitfires were tucked way up here towards Burtonwood village. And there the RAF guys had to go and work on them. One of our members, Harry Mitchell here, was based at Burtonwood very early on. This is a wedding a bit later on to Nancy. He tells me the story. Harry sadly has passed away now. But he said he had to get on his bike and cycle from the headquarters site here right across to wherever the aircraft were parked, assess what was needed, and he would carry with him maybe a radio to put in. He'd find that he was short of a few parts. He then had to cycle all the way back to get those parts, then cycle all the way back here to fit it. And that was done in all weathers, rain, hail, snow, sunshine, whatever. Harry was quite a character. His daughter is still a member of our association, and they met in the RAF, and they were waiting. So once we get in towards September, there's a huge range of all these different types of aircraft with the numbers against them. By early September, they delivered in the month 50 Spitfires down here, excuse me, which greatly assisted the Battle of Britain, but all these other types, including American types. 207 in the month. Now, all these guys were being posted into Burtonwood, but Burtonwood was a tiny village to the north of the airfield. Normally, airfields were named after the nearest village, and the nearest area was Great Sankey, and the railway station was at Great Sankey. But there were lots and lots of RAF stations starting with the name Great. So they decided they couldn't call it that, it would get confusing. So the nearest village the other way was Burtonwood, hence the name. So we were getting stories from guys like this who did their basic training in seaside resorts, Liverpool and Eastbourne and all over the country. They would be given a rail pass and told, you're posted to Burtonwood, go to Warrington. They get to Warrington and ask the railway staff, where's Burtonwood? They'd never heard of it. They were sent off to the police station, and in many cases they were sent up to different RAF locations around the area. A lot of people did not know where Burtonwood was. Eventually they were sent to Great Sankey police station, and initially they were given billeting orders and some rations, and they were told you are going to be billeted in a private house somewhere locally because the accommodation wasn't ready. And one flight sergeant wrote a letter to me saying he was billeted in Alderbank Road in Great Sankey. And he was a flight sergeant. He had to share a double bed with an airman, and it sagged in the middle, so we were ending up together in the middle. He was complaining bitterly that the majority of the food which the owners of the house gave them were sardines, and they had to be fed on the base because there just weren't enough rations to go around. although the householders were given extra rations to feed these guys. And slowly, as the accommodation was built on base, they were taken away. So a lot of American aircraft was beginning to flow through Burtonwood, but the major flow was yet to start. And what prompted that, of course, was Pearl Harbor. And here we have Pearl Harbor before the attack. Here we have it during the attack. And immediately after, of course, the USA was in World War II. But way before December 1942, the Americans knew they were going to be in World War II. So they were preparing for it. So they actually sent this guy, General Howard Brett, in March 1942, over to the UK to identify airfields which the United States Army Air Force could use when war broke out. So they were already identified and agreed with the British. And it was agreed with him that Burtonwood would become the major support base and would take on as secondary bases. It would be known as Base Air Depot 1. And it would take on Warrington, which is now British Aerospace Warrington, the factory up near Preston. Warrington became Base Air Depot 2, and Langford Lodge in Northern Ireland, which was Base Air Depot 3. And that was mostly civilian run by Lockheed Aircraft. Neither of the two red ones were ready when Pearl Harbor started. So they immediately poured straight into Burtonwood. And of course, its proximity to the docks was extremely beneficial, and also its distance from occupied Europe. So Ira Aker, who is the head of the 8th Air Force, now the 8th Air Force was formed just before the USA joined World War II, and it was the occupying air force in Britain. All the initial aircraft and personnel that came into Britain were American 8th Air Force. So the squadrons were 8th Air Force squadrons. Later, the 9th Air Force was formed, but Aker was the head of the 8th Air Force, a very tough cookie. He came over, he inspected Burtonwood, Warrington, Langford Lodge, and a lot of the bomber stations, which they would take over from the RAF. And right behind him came the head of the United States Air Force, which was Hap Arnold, the general there on the right-hand side. And he had said that by August 1942, that there would be 1,000 American aircraft in Britain. And by April 43, there'd be 3,500 aircraft. It didn't quite meet his wishes, but it got very close to it and then greatly exceeded what he was looking for. In the States, they were building aircraft like they were going out of fashion. They were building them as fast as they possibly could. This picture is taken in the States. And they were civilian manufacturers pouring out the aircraft. The big problem the Americans had was they didn't have enough trained mechanics in the military, in the USAAF. So what they did is they trawled the aircraft factories asking for volunteers who were prepared to go overseas. They didn't say where because it was secret and censorship was really strict. And the guy in the middle here, his name is Dick Lawrence, and he was a civilian employee at Kelly Air Force Base building bombers at the factory there. And he volunteered. He was age 19. He told me the story that he went home to see his mum and dad when he was told that he could volunteer. He said, "I'm going. You've got to give me permission." They had to actually give him permission. It was up to them whether he did or not, but because he was only 19, he needed their permission. So, excuse me, the picture is of him later when he was with the real Air Force. But he came over as a civil service technician, and they were civilians, and they wore a type of uniform but with no insignia, just in case there was a German invasion and they weren't treated as spies. But the civil service technicians were called feather merchants because they were treated much more gently than the military. And they were allowed to wear civilian clothing at night. They were going to Warrington in their Texan clothing with cowboy boots and 10-gallon hats. And they were somewhat vivacious, making a lot of noise, taking the pubs by storm and the girls. and some of the very, very first marriages occurred quite quickly after they arrived. Over 1,200 of them came to Burtonwood until there were enough American military personnel trained up to take over their place. They were then given the option, go back home and go back to your factory or join the military. And Richard did. He went back to the States, trained as an air gunner, came back and served the rest of the war as a gunner. He was a member of our association for many, many years, a lovely, lovely guy. Sadly, like all the other team, gone. They produced their own magazine, Flying Rumours, spelled the American way, RUMORS. And these are absolutely invaluable to me as a historian because they tell you what was going on. And it's all dedicated to the civil service technicians. And there is a memorial plaque to them here at Kelly Air Force Base in Texas. It was called Station X. They didn't know where they were going until they were on the ship because of wartime censorship. And it was always known when they wrote home, it was Station X. I think they were allowed to tell their people they were in England. This is another memorial here, an older one at the same base. But it was always civil service technicians at Station X. So the Americans were starting to arrive. This is subject now to a further lecture after this. The first Americans came on the 11th of June, 42. And so that was only shortly after Pearl Harbor. And they discharged by train at Earlstown Station, didn't even go into Warrington. Nothing like enough accommodation. They were spread out in various encampments built around Warrington. The ones that were lucky enough to live on site lived in pretty basic Nissen huts with no insulation, as you can see. They were just single skin, froze in the winter. Here's one of the coke stoves. And around Warrington, for those of you who live near Warrington, the base is up here, Warrington Centre there, and they were put in various different sites like Damhead Hall out here, Canada Hall up there near to where the M62 runs now, and Bruce Hall there, which later became the Cheshire Police Headquarters, and another hall way down here, back down in Marbury Hall. And they were bussed by truck backwards and forwards into Burtonwood every day until they could build the accommodation on site. When the women arrived, the WACs, the Women's Air Corps, or the Women's Army Corps, they were based here at Canada Hall to keep them separate from the guys on base, and they were trucked backwards and forwards to work from there. So that's how the Americans first arrived. So the base looked like this when they arrived, in that they had the different living sites, sites 4 and 5 out here, site 3 here with the roadway running between. It was a much, much busier location and much more built up than the little tiny 2-runway airfield that had started. And although they started coming in July 42, it was officially taken over in October 42 with a massive Great Union Jack flag, Stars and Stripes. And this is opposite the headquarter building on BRD site. The houses in the background are on Burtonwood Road. They're still there, but the site itself has been totally changed. So that is the RAF and the build-up of RAF Burtonwood until the Americans arrive. So I'll pick up next time on how it developed during World War II, what they did, some huge numbers and some fascinating things and modifications and what they got up to socially and work-wise.